Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis, and this is Coffee and Wisdom, a humanist perspective on theological questions. We've been asking what theologians call the anthropos question. Where is the human in religion? We ask these theological questions often kind of abstractly, but they get asked also in our own minds. Is there a God? If so, what sort of God? What are we here for? And what is a good life, and how may we live one? And yes, that arrow is pointing toward that little blue dot called the human earth. Well, a new study uncovers consistent patterns in the metaphors that people use to describe God. This is an article from scipost.com, great little web site that does all kind of interesting reporting of different kinds of psychological studies. I'm always fascinated by what they find. A new study sheds light, this article says, on the way people conceptualize God by exploring the metaphors people use when asked to describe God. According to the findings, people commonly use human imagery and power-related terms to describe God, with metaphors of God as power, human, and male. So the article goes on to say the biggest takeaway from this study is that while people vary in the metaphors they use to describe God, which is important in itself, there are some consistent patterns. God is most often described in terms of power, that is to say, creator, almighty, as human or anthropomorphic, bearded man in the sky, and as male, he and father. Notably, says the study, from these categories, people seem to understand God in terms that are most familiar to them, the human. This is likely because our thinking is constrained by our bodies. That means the easiest way we can understand something like the God concept is to imagine some sort of human entity. This is why God's actions are often described using human-like traits. End quote. Well, that has been pointed out before. As a matter of fact, the 20th century theologian Karl Barth, in a book titled The Word of God and Theology, he says this: one cannot speak of God simply by speaking of man in a loud voice. I'll repeat that. One cannot speak of God simply by speaking of man in a loud voice. And that's exactly what Karl Barth is pointing out here, that we use human terms to describe our concepts of God. And says Barth here, who was a theist, God is a lot bigger than just raising up a human to a little more powerful. And of course, we know the kinds of ideas that have been embedded in much of Christianity. Good old Johnny Cash, hit song called God's Gonna Cut You Down. And the whole point of that song is that no matter what kind of rich, wealthy, powerful, ne'er-do-well, evil villain, whatever, God will cut you down at the end. And that is designed as a way to keep human beings humble before our God, and therefore acting better toward each other. Well, last week I mentioned Pyragoras, who is often criticized for being someone who said man is the measure of all things. But I've also pointed out that we don't really know what Pyragoras was talking about, because he also pointed out that people make up human characteristics for what he saw as the Greek gods. But then he was saying, you know what, those gods just can't be real gods. They're just too human. There must be something bigger than that. And therefore, Pyragoras may have been one of the first monotheistic thinkers among the Greek philosophers. Well, yes, this whole idea that human beings are somehow not humble, but can be humble before God, is a very old idea. In the South, we have a good saying, he's too big for his britches, meaning someone is arrogant has too high an opinion of himself. And here we have a woman in distress saying, I have just realized I have become too big for my britches. Well, yeah, many Christians and many monotheists will argue that without a God concept, a huge, powerful God, human beings automatically in some way, naturally in some way, become unhumble and too big for our britches. So the question is this: can a humanist be humble? Well, we humanists, we are probably for the most part agnostic, and is we don't think there's a God like the one that is described as a human being, even though we don't know if there's some other kind. Also, there are lots of atheist humanists. So how is it that we humanists can be humble? Well, I shared with you last week something from Stephen Hawking that should make us humble. He said the human race is just a chemical scum on a moderate-sized planet orbiting around a very average star in the outer suburb of one among 100 billion galaxies. We are so insignificant that I can't believe the whole universe exists for our benefit. That would be like saying that you would disappear if I closed my eyes. You get the idea that that pale blue dot that Carl Sagan also talked about that thought should be a way of keeping us humble. So can imagining the universe as beyond human imagination keep us humanists humble? That's a really good question, isn't it? Well, one way that this is happening today on the cutting edge forefront of scholarly activities in anthropology and also it's called new materialism, and it's, you see, ontology, agency, and politics. Now, what does that all mean? Well, a new materialism is a way of going back into the idea of the human as being only a part of nature. I'm going to talk about that a little more on Thursday. This Sunday, coming up at 10:30 a.m. Central Standard Time, I do invite you to our assembly that's going to be called Art and the Sacred, in which we present the well-known podcaster J.F. Martel, also our very own Jacob Mullis, and me will be joining him in conversation to talk about art and the creation of an understanding of the sacred. Thanks a whole lot for joining me today, and a big thank you for financial support from Anita Martinez, Marcy Lessler, and Ren Nippling. Join me on Tuesdays and Thursdays for Coffee and Wisdom, and on Fridays at 9 a.m. Central Time, we do a live Zoom discussion of what we've been talking about this week. If you'd like that link, just email me at minister@firstunitarian.org. Thank you so much for being here today, and I will see you on Thursday.